Now, the scholar you're going to have today speak to you, David Head, Dr. David Head. Dr. Head, Professor Head, is a professor at University of Central Florida in Orlando. He's going to talk about an old story that you've heard before, but he's got some interesting new ways to think about it. And I'll let him give you the rundown on that. But let me tell you a little bit about him himself. He has a book that came out in 2015 called Privateers of the Americas, Spanish-American Privateering from the United States in the early Republic. He's spoken at many different conferences. He's published many articles and book chapters. He's had a lot of awards and fellowships, including the Historical Society of Pennsylvania Andrew Mellon Foundation Fellowship, the Gilder Lehrman Fellowship from the New York Historical Society, and the National Endowment for the Humanities Summer Stipend in 2016. He won an award for a brilliant article he wrote, the Ralph D. Gray Article Prize, which he published in the Journal of the Early Republic. He is well known amongst on the field as a rising star in the Early Republic historiography, and so I'm very much delighted to welcome him up here to speak with you today. So let's all give David Head a big welcome. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much for coming this afternoon. These are wonderful events. I've been to a couple previously this summer, sitting out in the audience here, and the bar has been very high from the previous two presentations I've seen, so I hope that I meet those lofty expectations for you today. So my topic, as you can see here, is the Newburgh conspiracy, an event at the end of the American Revolution that takes really the events unfold at the very end of 1782 into the spring of 1783. And this is a period after the last major battles, but before there's a formal peace treaty concluded. So it's kind of this period in suspense where there's not war but not peace either, as I'll highlight here in my presentation today. And many of you probably know the basic outline of the story. The officers get a little rebellious. And General Washington, you probably didn't call him George, did you? No. I do. I say, I'm going over to see George's house. He'd probably say, you're not welcome if you talk that way. But General Washington has to talk them down. And this is the famous incident where he puts on his glasses that he had recently acquired, and that simple gesture melts the hearts of his officers, and they come back to their senses. So that's probably the part of the story that you know pretty well. What I want to do today is to give you a broad overview of the issues that the Army is facing, some of the steps that the Congress and the people who are in charge of the finances are taking to meet the needs of the Army, and then how everything unfolded in one climactic week in mid-March 1783. I'll pay a particular attention to the various accounts of that climactic scene with the glasses that I've found so far. One of my priorities for the research I've done here at the library is finding as many different accounts of that scene as possible, from people who were there, people who recorded it close to the time it happened, people who remember it from later on. And as we'll see, there's some small differences that emerge of that scene. And then finally, I want to say a few things about what I think about the idea of the conspiracy itself and the larger significance it has for understanding Washington. Okay, so that's the plan for today. Okay. I want to start, though, with what I find is a wonderful little story about my first visit to Mount Vernon. It was in 1984. And I found this account. This had been recorded by my mom. She kept, for all of her kids, she kept the baby book kind of thing, and she had extensive narratives of birthdays and holidays and vacations. I'm one of 6, so I don't know how she had the time to do this. Okay. But this is what she wrote about my first visit to Mount Vernon in August of 1984. Okay. She wrote, "You got sick after we left the beach. We went to the Outer Banks of North Carolina at that time. But you were a good sport to trudge through the Mount Vernon in 93-degree heat with a headache and fever. Right after we left Mount Vernon, you threw up in a McDonald's. and were a sick little boy the rest of the trip home. Now, fortunately, isn't that what? It's just this wonderful little few sentences there. It really recreates the experience of trudging through Mount Vernon. Yeah. There would have been 4 of us, 4 kids at that time. My youngest sister would have been 6 months old, so you can get the idea of what it was like. And I had to be naughty and have an accident at the McDonald's. Okay. Luckily, my experience here has been much better than that. But I do think it's remarkable that 30-some years later, I'm back here at the same place. So it's really, I really like this story. It's really wonderful. Okay, back to the main event. The events that culminate in the Newburgh conspiracy really are a series of pressures that are mounting over time, especially at the end of 1782 and into the early days of 1783. The challenge that the government in Philadelphia is facing is enormous. And there are really 3 interlocking issues that really cannot be separated from each other. First of all, there's the debt that the nation as a whole faces. The debt is simply enormous. Robert Morris, who is the superintendent of finance, is charged with figuring out just how much does the United States owe. He's given that charge by Congress in early 1783, and he comes up with a number. So as of January 1st, 1783, the nation is $35 million in debt. I have no idea. How does he figure out right down to the penny? It makes me suspicious. How is that accurate? They say in social science, the general rule is the more specific the number, the more general the lie. But you get the idea, $35 million. Now, the way of paying that off, or at least paying the interest on it, that's really what the immediate problem is, just keeping current, paying the interest on it. Sources of revenue. Under the system at the time, so the Articles of Confederation had been approved in spring of 1781. So that was the system of government they're following. The revenue for the national government as a whole, so as distinct from the states, was raised through a kind of quota system, where each year the government would determine what its expenses were going to be. They would divide that up by the individual states, and each state had to send up a certain amount of money. And it wasn't, you just don't divide the whole thing by 13 because some states are big, some states are small, others are wealthy, others are poor. So there's a whole complex formula to determine who owes what. And one of the things you can easily imagine is that they fight over this. Everybody thinks they're charged too much, that every other state has been charged too little, and the mutual jealousies of this system are easy to imagine. Also, there's the practical challenge of determining who owes what. In order to address that system, that quota system, there had been proposed and approved by Congress in 1781 an impost. An impost is a tax on imports. The idea was there'd be a 5% tax on imports, and that would supplement the quota system. So this would be a tax collected at all the ports throughout the nation, regardless of which state they're in. It would be a tax that would be collected by agents working for the national government, so not the individual states. Those guys would be responsible to the national government, the idea being that they would be probably more likely to actually send the money up to the national government. So this would be a kind of independent revenue stream for the central government to make payments on the debt, and then maybe one day pay that debt down. Okay, so there's a debt problem, there's a revenue problem. This runs into the problem of the government structure. As I mentioned, the Articles of Confederation is the rules that they're following at the time. The Congress in Philadelphia, they really simply enact resolutions making recommendations to the states. So Congress resolves that Virginia's quota for the year 1783 is $1 million. They have no real binding force to make Virginia actually send that. It's a resolution, a recommendation. When I first started doing this research, that's one of the things that threw me off a little bit at first, because Congress would enact laws, or I thought they would enact laws like they do today, but then nobody follows it. It's like, well, Well, they enacted a law. Because it's not a law. It's a resolution, a recommendation. The impost failed. And the failure really comes at the very end of 1782. So in December 1782, 12 of the states had approved the impost, but one, the state legislature of Rhode Island, votes no. They vote not to approve it. And that means, under the rules in force, under the articles at the time, that that measure doesn't go into effect because new taxes had to have unanimous approval. At the same time, in December of 1782, Virginia takes back its approval. So they had approved it, and then they take it back. And maybe you could lean on Rhode Island, but they're not going to lean on Virginia. So that means that that potential source of revenue has evaporated. At the same time, again, fall, November, December of 1782, the officers who are with the Northern Army in Newburgh, New York, or near Newburgh, New York, they're kind of spread out over a wide area. They are grumbling about their conditions. Their complaints seem to center on three issues. The Massachusetts line, the Massachusetts soldiers, the officers, they get together and they decide to conduct a survey. They gather everybody's email address and then send a survey monkey out to everybody. But they have a survey of what are your complaints, your grievances. And these are collected, and there's about a dozen of these. They're collected in the Henry Knox papers, which are really wonderful. And this is the top of one of them, where it says, 2nd Massachusetts Regiment, grievances. If you take them all together, they have some individual idiosyncrasies. There are three issues that they focus on. Current pay, so they would like to be paid for their services as they're happening. They hadn't been paid for a while. Back pay, so they had been promised salaries, but those salaries had never come through for years at a time, perhaps. Now, going on with back pay is another issue, depreciation. So the money that the soldiers, the officers had been paid in had lost value over time because there's so much inflation. So you may have been paid $100 for a month of service in 1779. By 1782, that $100 is not worth nearly as much as it was when you had it. So they want some kind of corrective for that, because if they're going to get, that whatever the number was before, that's not going to be equal to what it actually was at the time. There's one reference I made said that the notes that the officers, or the notes that were circulating in 1779, or I'm sorry, I shouldn't say the exact date. The notes that had been circulating previously were discounted 5/6. So you'd have to take 5/6 off of the value. I guess if you were paid $60, then it's really only worth $10. Are you impressed with my fraction speed here on the fly? Yes, very good. So that's the second issue. So not just back pay, but the depreciation. And finally, for the officers, half-pay pensions. So the officers have been promised that they would be given the equivalent of half their pay for the rest of their life. So a half-pay pension for the rest of their life. In the fall, again, as I mentioned, really November, December, the officers get organized, they take the survey, they have the results, and they draft a formal memorial to Congress. And they select 3 men to take their memorial to Congress to formally represent their complaints and make their demands on Congress. One of the key lines from the officers' memorial, again, you see this is the copy from the Knox papers. The key line is here that I've highlighted. It comes at the bottom of that section. It says, "The uneasiness of the soldiers for want of pay is great and dangerous. Any further experiments on their patients may have fatal effects." So if you just thought this was complaining, it's not. There's a serious problem here that's brewing. Over January and February of 1783, the officers' delegation is in Philadelphia, and they are politicking behind the scenes, having dinner and breakfast and meeting with various key people, the Congressman, Robert Morris, pressing their cases as much as they can. They have the formal presentation of their memorial. They have formal meetings with Congressman and Robert Morris. They're working everything they can. They enjoy some successes in presenting their case. There's broad, widespread agreement that the officers' complaints are just. So I've seen that a number of times, where the congressmen are admitting the officers have a good case here. We ought to pay them. That's what justice demands. There's no one I've seen so far, at least in the letters of the congressmen I've been reading, who complains, well, they don't deserve it. Nobody says that. Another success for the officers is that they managed to get approval for 1 month of current pay. So Robert Morris, with the approval of Congress, authorizes 1 month of pay. So they'll be paid for January 1783. So that's something. And the hope is, amongst the congressmen, amongst Robert Morris, is that this will placate them for the time being. So those are some successes. But the problems are not going away. The finances are simply dire. And the finances are getting worse as time goes on. So worse than when they first arrived in December 1783. One real bombshell that drops in January 1783 is it turns out that Morris had overdrawn the French loan. So the United States is being kept afloat in part by loans from France. They've given a series of loans over time. And it's really, the way I think of it, is more, it's a line of credit. So they don't actually send the money across the Atlantic. It's just, the chain of obligations that one person has to another. Eventually, the thing securing all of it is France's credit to the United States. Well, Morris is doing the accounts, adding things up. He discovers they're over by about $700,000. Right? Does anyone have overdraft protection on their checking account of $700,000? Fortunately, mine only goes up to $500,000, so no. So, yes. How this happened, it's complicated, but I think the basic problem is that Benjamin Franklin in France was also paying bills drawing on the same line of credit. And they didn't really coordinate because they're so far apart. They each thought they had room. Right? I guess it's like if both you and your spouse are charging things on the same credit card or writing checks in the same account. Okay? So that's what happened. So they're overdrawn on the account, and that's really bad. One of the only ways that Morris has to hopefully help with that situation is that John Adams in the Netherlands had negotiated a loan from the Dutch merchants. We can see the problem here. They're using one loan to cover another. That's really bad. Okay? And again, you can see how this is like, pay off one credit card. You don't want to pay. You do a balance transfer one card to another. And you take out a home equity loan. Right? This doesn't really pay anything off. Just puts off the day of reckoning. The Army Memorial. So this is the memorial from the officers asking to be paid and for current pay, back pay, and pensions. It really gets entangled in these larger debates. And there's really no way to take it out of those larger debates. So just consider the Army's needs. And I have, for those of you who have a business background, you may be comforted to see we have a little flowchart kind of thing there. I have something for everyone here. So the Army pay issue there, it's also tied into the overall debt, because one of the major creditors are the Army. Okay? So there's the debt problem, the problem of revenue, how to obtain sufficient revenue. That's not just borrowing it from another country. This then gets into the larger question of the power of the states versus the power of the central government. Who's going to collect any revenue? Who's going to decide what the levels ought to be? Who makes the rules? And then that is tied up with the larger question of, well, what was the purpose of the revolution? If you are suspicious of the power of the central government, what's the point of taking power away from the states to give a taxing authority to a strong central government? That's what we fought the revolution for. On the other side, if you're afraid of what will happen if the debts go unpaid, you're afraid that the nation will collapse, you'll go to 13 separate countries, maybe be conquered by a European country in the future, then what was the point of the revolution? So the fundamental question, right, what are we doing all this for, is tied directly into how we're going to pay the Army. And they just can't disentangle those. Okay, this is the period as we move forward in time into February of 1783, as we get towards March of 1783, where in many accounts you see that there's an argument that in here there's some sort of conspiracy or plan that was concocted. These are two of the men who are often seen as kind of putting things together. That's Gouverneur Morris here sitting down. So that's Gouverneur Morris. My goal by the time I'm done writing this book is to be able to spell Gouverneur without looking. Maybe let's set like a shorthand code in Microsoft Word and we can do that. Gouverneur Morris there. This is Robert Morris. They just look like they're up to something, don't they? And this painting is from 1783, so it captures them plotting. The idea, insofar as there is possibly a conspiracy, is that the army should unite with the other creditors. So everybody who's owed something should stand together, make their argument together. There's even a suggestion that the army should announce that they won't disband, they won't go home until they are paid. Or possibly worse, maybe hint at, leaving the nation undefended, withdrawing to some other place in the West, or even marching on Philadelphia to force the Congress to pay them. There are a number of hints that are like that. In this period, the news that Britain is concluding peace reaches Philadelphia in mid-February 1783. So then there's a fear that once there's peace, well then there's no urgency to actually solving any of the Army's problems. You guys can go home now. We don't need you anymore. The check's in the mail. Of course, it's never going to come. So the idea being something has to happen now. So the real idea is to force Congress, and that will lead eventually to strengthening the government so they can pass new taxes, to pay off the debt, and to bring kind of the states, stop them from going their separate ways and bring them together to act in unison. So insofar as there is some kind of plot, it seems to be that is the goal or the plan. Now we have the climactic week in mid-March 1783. There's a messenger from Philadelphia, a man named Walter Stewart. He's an officer. He comes from Philadelphia to Newburgh. He's reporting for duty. Apparently, this is a problem that a lot of officers didn't want to be on duty in Newburgh. They'd rather be in Philadelphia or back home with their families. And Washington has to pester them to get back on the job. That's what Stewart is doing. He's coming back to report for duty in Newburgh. But apparently he carries a couple of letters and whatever else people may have told him to deliver orally. And he meets with Washington and also meets with Horatio Gates, another, after Washington, the highest-ranking officer in the camp near Newburgh. This is the house, Ellison House, where Gates was living with his assistants. I actually visited this last weekend. I went to a conference up in Connecticut. Then I went over to Newburgh on the way back and saw the sites here. So this is what it looks like in July. Probably not what it looks like in March, I'm guessing. And this part over here, this is an addition. So this is what the house looks like here today. So Gates is staying there with his assistants. And it seems that in that house, in mid-March, they drafted a letter that is circulated anonymously. It seems that Gates' assistant, John Armstrong Jr., actually writes the letter, but he certainly had help with it. They was kind of working on it together. It's a fairly small house. I mean, it's not like he had some secret place to write this, like up in the attic or somewhere. So there's most likely a joint effort. And the letter itself that circulates calls for the officers to meet and to decide and draft a new, bolder message is the content. Okay? So not the kind of pleading tone they had before, but something bolder, demanding action now. Here are some key passages from the anonymous letters that circulate. One argument that it makes is the time for patience is over. I put in the bold there. That's not in the original. I put that bold in just so you can highlight a few key passages. It recommends to change the milk and water style of your last memorial. okay, the one from December. Assume a bolder tone, decent but lively, spirited and determined, and suspect the man who would advise more moderation and longer forbearance. So something bolder, stronger, and don't listen to people who want to counsel having moderation in the future, more patience. There's a threat that's stated. It's implied, but it's not too implied. It says, the slightest mark of indignity from Congress now must operate like the grave and part you forever. So that is part you, the officers from Congress, forever. Then any political event, the Army has its alternative. If peace, that nothing shall separate them from your arms but death. So nothing shall separate the officers, the Army, from their arms but death. So you're going to hold on to their arms, refuse to disband. If war continues, that courting the auspices and inviting the direction of your illustrious leader, you will retire to some unsettled country, smile in your turn, and mock when the fear cometh on. And so, in other words, if there's peace, we won't give up our guns, and if there's still war continue, we're going to leave you to fight on your own. And then, you're in big trouble. Okay? They'll laugh at you afterwards. Washington's reaction to this is swift. He immediately circulates his own orders, calling off the meeting. So the anonymous letters from Armstrong, they call for a meeting the next day. Washington says there will be no meeting, but he reschedules that meeting for March 15th, for the Saturday of that week. I think this is giving him time to coordinate a response with his advisors and those he trusts. Henry Knox, he consults in this period, who was commanding at West Point at the time. And also, probably, hopefully, to get the guys some time to cool off. Another anonymous address circulates the day after that saying, well, this is perfect. We wanted this anyway. March 15th is fine for us. Okay, so that then brings up the climactic event. This is Washington's house here. So this is the Hasbrouck house. The Hasbrouck family lived. So this is where Washington was staying. This is in Newburgh, New York itself. The Ellison House is down in New Windsor, which is a couple miles away. It's the next town over. I like Gates's house better. Maybe I just like I like the red and the white there. It looks more stately. This one looks a little, But he has a better view. This is, you can see, it overlooks the Hudson River. This one just looks out onto a park today. So maybe that's what the advantage was. Okay. The climactic event here takes place at what's called the Temple of Virtue. So this was a building that they had recently constructed and opened in February of 1783. And it was kind of like a public gathering place. It's a long, low building. It was hewn out of the trees there. They put it up over a 6-week period. So kind of a gathering hall. The idea is there could be religious services there. They could have social events. They open it with a dance and party and kind of thing. And there are a couple of offices off the wings for you could have meetings in there. So kind of an all-purpose gathering place they could have, because the Army is spread out over such a large area in their encampment. This is where Washington comes and makes a formal address. A couple of significant things about him simply arriving. It wasn't expected that he would address the assembly that day. He doesn't say that he's coming. The implication is that Gates, as the highest-ranking officer, will be the one in charge. So Washington shows up unannounced. And they say, sorry, General, you're not invited. No. So he, of course, comes in and takes command of the session. This is also one of the very few times, if not the only time, that Washington addresses such a large assembly of his officers at the same time. There's at least 100 men who are present in the room that day. Usually he would have addressed smaller groups of people who then would delegate his orders to others. So that's significant in itself. Let's take another look here at the inside of the temple before I move on to the event itself. So this is a recreation. So the New York State Parks Department, they put up a replica of the temple. It's probably a few hundred feet from where the real one was. They have a marker where it really was. But they have this replica, and again, I visited this over the weekend. So that gives you an idea of what it looks like. And I was curious to see, well, how big is this place? It's big enough, you could easily fit 100 people in it. So that part of the story checks out. So that is the kind of raised platform where Washington would have spoke. Okay, so that's what it looks like there. Here's me in Washington's spot. Washington probably did not wear shorts and a Notre Dame t-shirt, but trying my best to channel the moment there. Okay, so the speech itself. I'll get back here. Here is some of the arguments that Washington makes. I think there's several key arguments here, but a few just I want to mention here very briefly. They're worth considering in depth. He argues that the anonymous letters and their sentiments are unmilitary. I think that's a key argument. You can see that's something that would hurt, right? Officers to call them unmilitary. He doesn't call them unmilitary. He calls the sentiments in the letter unmilitary. Okay, so not making a direct accusation. He says that the remarks are addressed more to the feeling and the passion than to the reason and judgment of the army. He calls the idea that the army should either disband or withdraw from the field, he calls it insidious. He also calls it impractical. I like this section in particular because he says, what are you going to do? You're going to take your family, your wives, your children, your farm, and you're going to move someplace else? He even says, he doesn't quite say it this way, but he says more or less, you can't take your farm with you. What are you thinking? It's like fixed in one place. So it's impractical, but also insidious to even suggest that the army would abandon the civil authorities in their time of need. Washington does no more than scold, though. He also appeals to their pride, the sense of pride in themselves, and he reassures them that he's proud of them. Washington recommended, I have a letter from him recently to another officer recommending that affection is one of the most important things you can cultivate between you and the men you lead, that they should have an affection for you. So they should love you. And that's what he kind of reinforces that here. He mentions, I've never left your side one moment, but when called from you on public duty. I have been the constant companion and witness of your distresses, and not among the last to feel and acknowledge your merits. In other words, he always does. He does this. I forget what the literary device is called. But rather than saying I was the first to acknowledge, he always says I was not the last. He does that a lot. I have considered my own military reputation as inseparably connected with that of the army. That's really important because Washington's military reputation was everything to him. It says our reputations are linked. As my heart has ever expanded with joy when I have heard its praises, and my indignation has arisen when the mouth of detraction has been opened against it. So your successes, your joys are my joys. When you were insulted, I am insulted. His recommendation as he ends the address is to trust Congress. That's the final conclusion that it comes to. He says that honorable body entertain exalted sentiments of the services of the army, and from a full conviction of its merits and sufferings will do it complete justice, that their endeavors to discover and establish funds for this purpose have been unwearied and will not cease till they have succeeded. I have not a doubt. But, like all other large bodies, where there is a variety of different interests to reconcile, their deliberations are slow. Why then should we distrust them? In other words, Congress, he's certain is working on it, they respect you, but they're a large political body with different opinions, and you know how they are. So just because they're slow working, that doesn't mean that they don't want to help. It means that that's just the nature of the body that they work in. So continue to trust Congress. That then, of course, concludes his address, and then Washington pauses, and he takes out a letter from a congressman, Joseph Jones of Virginia, who Washington had been corresponding with regularly. And it seems to be that when he's switching over from his own address that he wrote himself in a large handwriting that he was familiar with, and then went to read the letter from Jones, whose smaller handwriting, who he didn't know very well. Right? He couldn't see it all that well, so then he had to take out his glasses. And of course, this is when he excuses himself for having, and he says he's grown not only gray, but also blind in their service. And then he reads the letter from Jones, which is full of sentiment that Congress is working on the problem. They expect to have some solution for the Army, and that breaks the tension there. This is where I'd like to, for dramatic effect, I was going to pull out my own glasses here. But can anybody tell what's wrong with my glasses? I'm missing on the lens. That's my daughter broke my glasses, so I don't have a good prop anymore. So George didn't have children. He never had this problem. Right? Can you imagine how history would have been different if he had a toddler who broke his glasses the night before his big speech? And then the officers wouldn't have, their hearts wouldn't have melted. They would have mutinied, and everything would have fallen apart. I want to look here at some contemporary accounts. This is, I think, interesting. You see the differences that emerge over time. So the story that I've told it is generally everybody agrees on, but some of the timing of the key events, the key moments here is a little off, and the words that Washington spoke are a little different in the various different accounts. So writing a day or two after the meeting, Philip Schuyler is an assistant to Henry Knox. He wrote to one of his correspondents, he wrote that Washington had said, "You see, gentlemen, that I have not only grown gray, but also blind in your service." Again, I added the emphasis there. The account that most people follow, most previous books on the conspiracy have followed the account of Samuel Shaw. He was the secretary at the meeting, and he writes a memoir that includes some of his letters from the time. And he has an extensive description of the entire scene. That's probably why most people follow this. And he writes, "His Excellency, after reading the first paragraph, made a short pause, took out his spectacles, and begged the indulgence of his audience while he put them on, observing at the same time that he had grown gray in their service and now found himself growing blind." So slightly different. The meaning's a little bit different if it's your service in their service. We'll see in a second here. There are also accounts later on that say the nation's service. So whose service is he growing blind in? Another account that I see, this is from Henry Knox, again in March. He simply says the general's address is a masterly performance. Well, I think Knox helped him draft it, so that's a little inside dealing there. So the masterly performance. Timothy Pickering is the quartermaster of the Army, is also present there. He wrote 2 letters, one to a friend and one to his wife, the day after the meeting. And this is one of the quotes from the letter to his friend. He writes, "After this," so after his main speech, "the general read a private letter of the 27th of February from a member of Congress, written without the most distant expectation of its being used on such an occasion, but containing sentiments and information pertinent to the occasion. He thought himself justified in the communication of it." What's missing? The quote, right? The money quote there is missing. And he mentioned the glasses is missing. Now, of course, that doesn't mean it didn't happen. It's just that Pickering didn't record it at that time. So that wasn't part of the narrative there. A lot of help you were, Timothy Pickering. I needed another see, what did he think they really said? Now, another interesting thing, you see some later accounts in the 1820s. Some of the guys who were present there as young officers, they are interested in finding out what happened again in the 1820s. John Armstrong, he apparently was working on a history of the United States, and he wrote a kind of anonymous letter to Pickering asking him for his recollection on that of what happened. This is 40 years later. Armstrong, in his letter, he said he thought that Pickering was the only person who objected to Washington's speech. And Pickering gets upset about this and said, "Of course I didn't. I wasn't the only one who objected to the speech." There's also disagreement about the contents of the letter that Washington wrote. So Armstrong is asking Pickering, what does he remember? And Pickering gets all angry about being accused of being the only one who dissented, and he starts writing a number of people for what their recollection was. So that's where we get some of the later recollections, because Pickering wanted to have the goods on Armstrong to prove that Armstrong's recollection was wrong and Pickering's was right. Okay, so that's where we get these accounts 40 years later. This is really interesting. Pickering, in writing to the other people who he once, he's saying, this is what I remember, what do you remember? In his letters, he says, now he remembers, the general, having begun to read his address without his spectacles, presently paused, and while pulling them out of his pocket, he said, I have grown gray in the service and am now growing blind. So he remembers this 40 years later. It wasn't in the letter immediately afterwards, but now that's the item that he remembers most about the incident. So it includes that there. Notice here, this happens in a few of the accounts, they place Washington putting on his glasses not after the address to read the letter from Jones, but before the address, before it started, so at the very beginning. That seems less likely given what I just said about how it was enlarged. The Massachusetts Historical Society has the actual version that Washington read. His own handwriting is large, so that seems unlikely that it was that chain of events. But it's interesting that they kind of read that back into the whole event. This happened throughout the whole time they were overcome emotionally. David Cobb is one of the people that Pickering writes to, and Cobb has to confess that he wasn't there. He was assigned to Newburgh, but he was outside of the camp that day. So he wasn't actually at the meeting. But he says that he heard about it afterwards, and this is what he remembers. And again, it's a very similar narrative of the story. He says, Washington said, gentlemen, you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown gray, but almost blind in the service of my country. So here, not your service, but the service of my country. And he says that can come off a little sarcastic. I mean, it's the service of my country. How about you guys? So a little bit different there. And then he says that this drew tears from many of the officers present. Another person that Pickering writes to is Nicholas Fish, another officer who was also not present. See, Pickering doesn't remember who was there and who wasn't very well. Or it also could be that these are the only people he still knew who were still alive at that time. So he writes to those people who weren't there. He says that, again, he heard all that had taken place, even the circumstance of the general's spectacles, as stated in your letter, and the effect produced by it. So this is sort of common knowledge. Well, I wonder here how much of the spectacle story Fish remembered himself before he was prompted by Pickering's letter. So Pickering's letter comes first. Does he say, oh yeah, the spectacles? Does he really? You can't say one way or the other. But it's possible Pickering primed him to remember this. So who knows? So what really happened? What really happened on that day? This is my own interpretation here. And this is something that's provisional, and as I continue to do research, it's possible that I'll change my mind as I find new work, new information that emerges. So it's possible that a couple years from now, my book will be out, you'll go to buy it, and I'll say something completely different, and you'll say, wait, that's not what I remember. But I'm open to being convinced by the evidence. But here's where I am now from what I've read. First of all, I have to confess my bias in thinking about this issue. I think that's always important to do, to let you know where I'm coming from. I'm skeptical of conspiracy thinking in general. I think that it's much more likely, not that things happen by accident, but that the events that unfold all around us are so complex that it's very difficult to plan all of them. And that it's only in looking back that we can see how event A led to B, the C, the D, down to Z. It's not that someone at the beginning planned this all out to happen. The distances involved, the difficulty of communication, and the idea that you can pull this off timed exactly, that seems to stretch credulity to me. That's not to say, though, that there aren't conspiracies. So it is possible, but just going into this, I'm skeptical of that. There are a number of provocative statements, and you can find these pretty easily, about people who seem to be boasting that they have a plan to enact. Here's just one from Gouverneur Morris, who I've cleverly abbreviated G. Morris because I cannot spell Gouverneur without looking. It says, the army have swords in their hands. He's writing this to John Jay, who's negotiating for peace in Paris. So he's reporting on the situation early January. So Morris says, the army have swords in their hands. I'm glad to see things in their present train. Depend on it. Good will arise from the situation to which we are hastening. And this and this you may rely on, that my efforts will not be wanting. He's saying it's good the army's upset. It's good that they're armed. This is going to bring things to a positive resolution, and I'll do everything I can to make it happen. Now, I think that provocative statements like that, and there are a number of these, are not necessarily evidence of a concerted plan. We don't exactly know the circumstances that he's writing under. He could be exaggerating. He could be having a bad day. This is on January 1st he's writing this. Maybe he was up celebrating New Year's and he was a little tipsy that day. I don't know. I'm not myself when I'm hungry, so maybe I say things, I do things that I wouldn't normally do. We don't know any of those things. But at the same time, it could be also that this is a authentic snapshot into how he's thinking. So it's hard to work on what is actually happening because we only have their letters. They're somewhat out of context to look at later on. I think that Philadelphia is working on the problem. So Morris is clearly in crisis mode. He's pulling out all the stops to try and find some money to put everything together to pay the army off. It's possible that in his desperation, got so desperate, especially with peace approaching, that he wanted something to push the army forward, to push things to a final crisis. They thought it was either the country collapses or we have some sort of military coup or something, and one is not necessarily worse than the other. That's possible, and perhaps I'll find evidence of that, and when I do, I'll have a completely different talk for you. But I'm somewhat skeptical of that because Morris is working on this problem really hard. I think the message is really that the Army should help keep the pressure on, to stick together with the other creditors, not to go to the states to pay them, to keep the pressure on the national government. I think this is a way, the sort of bolder statement that the Army might make, is a way to refocus Congress and the states as the debate unravels. It's going off into all kinds of other different directions about who owes what for the quota payment, what the nature of the government really is, all those kinds of questions. In this account, then, if I take those two things as being true, first of all, the officers overreacted. That's the conclusion to come to. And that their letters, that Armstrong drafts, go too far. They're too bold. They went too much, too loud, too threatening. That then brings up a new problem. Why does Washington crush the anonymous letters? If there wasn't really a threat of a mutiny or a plot to revolt, then Washington certainly acts as if there is. He denounces this. He says that this is one of the times of maximum crisis. This is very dangerous. So Washington acts as if there's a determined plot against him. So that's then the new question that I have to struggle with. Why does Washington act that way? And the possible answer is that the Army here, by even hinting at disrespecting Congress, is endangering their honor. And that was the one thing that the Army really had to bargain with, was their honor. The idea that they weren't like other groups in the country, that they did things not necessarily for money, but they did things for the greater good, for the greater patriotism, that they had superior virtue to others. And that's actually where their power to affect political change came from. So their power comes from staying out of politics. And strangely, that's what gives them power in politics. So this is a threat to their honor, and it's also bad politics. It doesn't make sense. It's not going to achieve the things that they want. Just as a very quick example here, he uses the word gentleman 5 times. And he does this in a way that's easy to miss, I think, because it's just kind of thrown in there. And for us, gentlemen doesn't mean a whole lot. All right, say, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. You've been a great audience. I'll say that in a few minutes. It's just nice. It's pleasantry. It's like, how's the weather today? It's hot, yes. But in the 18th century, gentlemen meant something very important. And these officers thought of themselves as gentlemen, not like common people. And Washington is reminding them of that. You have honor, don't waste it. He also appeals to their patriotism and their sense of patient virtue. So maintain your patriotism and your virtue. Don't throw it away for this. Finally, to bring everything to a conclusion, I think this points towards seeing Washington in a new light, or at least a light that we're not used to seeing him in. And that's as a very skilled politician. I think today, when politics is so ugly, it's distressing, I try to avoid any political news whatsoever. To tell people, I do the past, not the present or the future. it's easy to want to see, it's really, you want to see somebody who's above politics, who didn't get down in the mud with everybody else. And Washington really sees there's value in having that image, but it's not because he doesn't want, he knows what he's doing, and he knows that there's power in seeming to be above the fray. So he's acting out politics by not appearing political. And that's very skilled to do that. Now, Washington, his victory is incomplete here when it comes to Newburgh. And I don't want to just focus on, well, Washington was a wonderful politician. He always had the path forward. It turns out the Army, they trust Washington to petition Congress on their behalf. Congress agrees to pay the pensions. Okay, so Congress goes along, but they never actually deliver the tax revenue to actually pay the officers. So this doesn't work out. The officers don't really get paid. They get more promises, more paper promising to pay them in the future. What happens to the paper in the meantime? It depreciates in value. And it's really only the Constitution that saves the situation. And that's a problem with the debtors in the future. So Washington's victory was incomplete. He talked the soldiers down. He realized that their best chance of success lay in emphasizing their honor, their virtue, their commitment. But given the circumstances, that wasn't enough. There were simply problems were just too overwhelming to come and have a nice solution to. So on that rather depressing note, that there are some problems we can't fix, no matter how wonderful our leaders are. And sometimes we have choices in our leaders, and neither one of them, any of them, are going to really fix things the way we'd like. I'll bring things to a close. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being such a wonderful audience. And I'll be happy in the time that remains to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.